World War I, Part 3. When Germany and the Central Powers agreed to an armistice on the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918, they agreed largely based on Woodrow Wilson's published 14-point plan for peace. Woodrow Wilson would travel to Versailles in France, where the treaty would be negotiated, bringing with him, of course, his 14-point plan that Germany had based its hopes on, its hopes that a fair and equitable treaty into the war could be negotiated. So let's talk a little bit about the 14 points that Wilson had published prior to the end of the war. Now remember, Wilson is the third progressive president of the progressive era. He's an academic by profession, a college president, and like any good progressive, he believes if you can identify the cause of a problem, you can solve it by government action, in this case international action. Now, Wilson believes that's true of war. So when he talks about during the war in some of his great speeches about making the world safe for democracy, about World War I being a war to end all wars, he truly believes this as a progressive. And so when he looks at the war and tries to figure out what caused this worst war to date in history, he comes up with a list of causes. And he looks at those in terms of his 14-point plan, and he fashions 14 points or solutions to the key causes of World War I. Now, for our purposes, we won't go through all the 14 points, but he does a pretty good job of coming up with basic solutions to the key causes of World War I. And you have, of course, a much more exhaustive list in your chapter. But for example, freedom of the seas is one of his 14 points, his solutions. Remember, those U-boat attacks certainly led the U.S. into this war as a main cause of the U.S. entrance into the war. Had there been freedom of the seas, freedom of trade, another key point of his 14-point plan, certainly there could have been some aspects of this war averted, certainly for the United States as well as for other nations. He certainly has a number of other points that would have prevented, he thought, war. Most scholars agree with him to this day. He believed if he could get his 14 points implemented directly into the Treaty of Versailles that will end this war, that he could perhaps end war, at least for the immediate future. So he comes to France with this idealistic position, and he meets tremendous resistance from the leaders, especially of the Allied powers, England especially, and France, who have lost an entire generation of young men in the field in Europe on the Western Front, and are not prepared to let Germany and Italy off the hook so easily as to adopt the 14 points that Wilson is so hopeful for. So Wilson battles mightily, and he does the best that he can do, and he gets a few of his 14 points in the treaty, but overall he fails to get the fair and equitable peace that he hopes for, as Germany is really singled out as the cause of the war, made to pay for the war, and even made to sign a statement that should literally cost the wars. Well, let's look at what Wilson's able to get done in the treaty. He is able to get self-determination, what he calls self-determination, for subject countries, countries that he felt if they had their own self-government, what he calls self-determination, if they had their own independence, would help preserve the peace going forward in Europe. So he's able to redraw the map of Europe. We'll look at that in just a moment. He's also able to get the League of Nations, the forerunner of today's United Nations, in the treaty. And this was his most cherished point of his 14 points, because he believed this organization could keep the peace going forward. But it was so controversial at home because we do not, historically as Americans, get involved in what is often called entangling or foreign alliances. And the Republican Party, the GOP party, was absolutely, almost unanimously opposed to this, controlled the Senate, and was not about to approve this part of the treaty. They are often controlled by the isolationist wing of the Republican Party, and they would be opposed to the League of Nations at all costs. So a great battle is going to take place when Wilson brings this treaty back to the United States. Let's look first at the map. And so here you have the map from your textbook, and you can see how the map is redrawn. If you look here, especially at Central Europe, so you can see Central Europe is highlighted. And if you look at a map before the war, now look at a map of Europe after the war, you're going to notice that countries like Poland exist now that did not exist before the war. Poland is recreated. Look down to the south, you see Czechoslovakia is newly created as a homeland for the Czechs. Hungary and Austria are created largely out of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. Yugoslavia is created for the Slavs. Romania, and you can see all of this redrawing here, the map of Europe. All of this done in Wilson's support in order to try to create self-determination or independence for these groups that had not had it. After all, it was in Yugoslavia that the Austro-Hungarian heir to the throne, Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated in a move for independence there against Austro-Hungarian control, the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. So this is an attempt to forestall that sort of rebellion again that might lead to a future war. Now, interestingly, too, we got real significant action in the Middle East, and the cutaway on your map shows that, so I'll just point out that. Now, this is largely the work of the British. The United States was not involved in the Middle East at this point, so it's largely the British, and it's largely the work of Winston Churchill, who will be very important during World War II for us. But it's largely Winston Churchill's work in redrawing the map of the Middle East and creating here Iraq. This is when the country of Iraq is created that has been such an issue for us in the present. So this is done during World War I at the end in the treaty negotiations. Now Wilson, having failed to get most of his 14-point plan in the treaty, has done his best. He's gotten the League in, he's gotten the map of Europe redrawn. He comes back to the United States and he finds the recalcitrant Senate full of Republicans. Wilson's the Democratic president of the era, who will not approve the treaty with the League in it. Wilson does what most presidents would do in this situation, with the public support clearly behind him in the treaty. He goes directly to the public to campaign to try to get the public to overwhelm the Senate with demands to pass the treaty. He goes by train, since that is the main transport of the era. Wilson has always been rather sickly. You can see he looks frail. Now we know he suffered from the flu, that he's had the 1918 flu. So he's very frail, very ill. He collapses while he's on this whirlwind tour trying to whip up public support for the treaty. He has a terrible stroke when he gets back to the White House, and he's incapacitated for the last bit of his presidency. So the end result is that without Wilson being healthy to fight for the treaty is never ratified. He's so sick, he's never willing to compromise with the Senate Republicans. They're not willing to compromise with him, and the treaty is, in the end, a casualty of all of this. We're going to later end the war officially without treaty, simply by congressional action. So we're never party to the treaty. We're never a member of the League of Nations. And after this, the war is just the last straw for the progressives. It breaks the progressive spirit, and we enter the 1920s, this famous decade of the roaring 20s of materialism and economic excess. But we do emerge out of the war wealthy, a creditor nation. We're loaning money to everybody in the world. We become a great power for the first time in our history. We enjoy an economic boom until the bust, of course, occurs in 1929 and the Great Depression begins. Internationally, even though the Allies have won the war, Germany has been left humiliated, poverty-stricken, and bitter. And this circumstance will lead to the rise of the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler. And so within a couple of decades, the war that was to end all war will end up giving rise